Mr. Stephen Lindley is the program manager in Los Angeles for Brady United Against Gun Violence. He looks like he's 15, but he is a 27-year law enforcement veteran. During these 27 years, Stephen worked for the National City Police Department in San Diego County and for the California Department of Justice. He worked a variety of assignments, including internal affairs, homicide, sexual predator apprehension, and the Attorney General's Protection Detail. He oversaw the California Department of Justice's Bureau of Firearms, and later the department's Division of Law Enforcement with its 1,100 agents and professional staff. Stephen served as the chief of the Bureau of Firearms for more than 8 years, during which he testified in over 80 firearms-related legislative hearings, collaborated on more than 100 firearm-related bills, and is assisted in authoring and implementing California's landmark ammunition background check initiative. Stephen has a bachelor's degree in criminal justice, a master's degree in business, a postgraduate certificate in epidemiology from Johns Hopkins University. He is a part-time high school teacher in Corona, California, and is a member of the Board of State and Community Corrections in California Violence Intervention and Prevention Executive Steering Committee. Stephen comes highly recommended from our Laguna Woods Democratic Club member, Ms. Sarah Weaver. Thank you, Sarah, and Stephen, thank you so much for being here, and if you need water, here it is.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for asking Brady to be here tonight. She said my background is in law enforcement. I am a lifelong Democrat, which oftentimes those two entities don't go very well together. But I'm here to talk about firearms. And unless you want to talk about abortion or religion at a party, nothing can get people more angrier than those two than firearms. So when people used to ask me what I did, I always told them I was a lawyer at DOJ. And then they would say, well, what type of cases? I work death penalty cases. Oh, that's exciting. I go, what type of cases do you work? You go to court often? I go, no, I actually never leave my office. I just do briefs. And they would walk away. So it is a very large subject. It's a very heated subject right now. But some of the things that we do want to talk about is what makes California a little bit different. And that is pretty small. California has been challenged in almost every firearms law that we have on our books. My short time at DOJ, I was sued 82 times by the gun industry or other gun entities for implementing laws that were passed here in California. That was after the Heller and McDonald decision, where the NRA and other pro-gun organizations looked at litigation and ways to overturn state laws and even federal laws. But before we go into some of the legal challenges that we have here in California, let's talk about some of the things that we do well here in California that have been on the books for a long time. A lot of states look at California and they try to emulate what we've done. But what we've done hasn't been done in the last 10 years or the last 20 years. We've been doing this for about 35 years. So there's a lot of history behind California, our data systems, our legal challenges, and how we put things together. It's very difficult for other states or even the federal government to do what California has done because it takes time. If some of us, well, fortunately for this group, when I talk to my high school students, I talk to them about the 80s, and they just go, oh, that's the retro. And I go, no, that makes me feel old. But those of us that have lived here in California, especially in Southern California in the 80s and early 90s, it was a lot more violent then than it is today. Now, oftentimes we hear about it more because of social media and it gets to our attention quicker. But if you look at the crime stats, even with the lower overall population, California had some significant violent issues, especially in Southern California. That has dramatically changed over the last 30 to 35 years. And again, a lot of different issues made that so. But one of the things is our comprehensive process when it comes to firearms, our background checks and other issues. So California, we have to have a background check for all firearm purchases. That is a very extensive state background check process where we're looking at a person's criminal history, their mental health background, any types of restraining orders, or if they're what's called, which is a great term, a fugitive from justice. Basically, they have some type of warrant out for their arrest. For years, we've had it that any warrant out for your arrest would be prohibiting. That changed a few years ago because if you had a traffic ticket, should you really be prohibited from purchasing a firearm? Even the Democrats said probably not, because that's one thing that a lot of us actually may have had and not known that we forgot about a ticket, and that would prevent us from doing a lot of things. So the law was changed that you could only, if you had a warrant, it would have to be a warrant for a crime that, if convicted, would prohibit you from possessing a firearm. So if you had a traffic warrant, you had a warrant for graffiti or jaywalking, that wouldn't be prohibited. So that's the basis of California's background check process. We also, obviously, because we're a state in our federal government, we also do the NICS check, which is the National Criminal Instant Background Check System, which is administered by the FBI, which I actually think California does a better job in, because NICS only has 3 days maximum to do their background check. In California, we have a total of 10 days to do the background check. Part of that is a cooling off period, which does work. The other part of that is just allowing the analyst with the Department of Justice to do a full and thorough background check. The other issue that we have here in California that the federal government and most other states don't is you hear about the gun show loophole or the private party transfer loophole, where you can basically sell a gun to your neighbor if you're in, let's say, in Arizona or Texas or Florida. So I don't know how close you are with most of your neighbors, but I probably would not sell a gun to my neighbor. But here in California, if you do, that background or that transfer has to go through a firearms dealer and is still subject to a background check process. So again, California is setting the tone for not only most other states, but for the federal government and how we're looking at our background check process. There's some other minutia with that. You have to have a firearm safety certificate in order to purchase a gun here. That safety certificate is good for 5 years. And what that basically does is you have to pass a test and you have to demonstrate that you can safely handle a firearm. Is that not common sense? I mean, I would hope so. There was an issue that came up with somebody who was blind. They passed the test with 100%, and because they used a firearm before they became blind, they could actually do safe handling by just manipulation. So it's just some basic things that, it's protected under ADA, but nevertheless, we should ask people. I don't want to quote Spider-Man here, but with great power comes great responsibility. You have a firearm. You should know how to safely use that firearm, put it unsafe. And we also have mandatory safe storage laws here in California. So again, things that are creeping up in other states, California already has. All right, I actually went through a lot of that with what is checked, and probably better because I can't see it from here. So, and I did it. All right. So something that is extremely unique to California that no other state, the federal government, or no other nation has is our armed and prohibited person system. So when I was a new officer, we'd have to run 4 or 5 different databases to determine if somebody that we stopped and had a gun, whether that person was allowed to actually have that gun, to see if they were prohibited from possessing them. So in the late 1990s, DOJ started looking at the issue and said, yeah, we do contain all those systems. And although they don't all talk to each other, they can. So on a bipartisan issue, both Democrats and Republicans. Again, this is this is like 2001 now, which is a different time in our state. But everyone agreed, well, that's a good program. Let's put it together. So the armed prohibited person system was conceived. It took a few years to build the system up, became active in late 2006. And what it does is it takes people who have legally possessed a firearm, purchased it at some time, or registered an assault weapon, and it runs it on a nightly basis against all of our data systems to identify people who have subsequently become prohibited from possessing a firearm. So let's say in my case, I can't remember the last time I bought a gun, but there's one in there. Let's say I bought it in 2001. And last week, I had a mental health issue and was taken to a mental health facility, and they kept me more than 72 hours. That makes me prohibited here in California from possessing a firearm for a certain amount of time. That would be identified by the system, and then an analyst would look at that, and they would determine that, yes, that's Steve Lindley that bought that gun in 2001. It's the same Steve Lindley who had that mental health issue last week. So I would be put onto the armed prohibited person system as a prohibited individual that's possessing firearms. Most cities and counties don't really investigate that, but Cal DOJ does. And over the years of the system, they have disarmed, I would guess, somewhere around 50 to 75,000 people since 2007, and confiscated well over 100,000 firearms. However, it's a very controversial system because people in the California Rifle and Pistol Association, the NRA, always talks about registration always leads to confiscation. Well, in this case, the person legally possessed a firearm and purchased it. But after that, they became prohibited. Shouldn't we be identifying that and trying to take guns away from people who have shown that they have a propensity for violence or mental health issues? And not all those prohibitions are lifetime prohibitions. I can tell my students, we've all had mental health issues at one time or another. So we've had bad days and we've had good days, but it's not something that is going to be a lifelong prohibition in most cases. That is very unique to California. Other states have looked at it, but this is based on systems that were put into place in the 1980s or the early 1990s. It takes a lot to put those systems together. They're costly, they take time, and to get them to all talk to each other is difficult. So again, when I talk to my high school students and I tell them about DOS, about the green screen, they just laugh at me. But most of us know what DOS is, and I've worked with it to one extent or another. A lot of these systems are still based on DOS, believe it or not. So if you're telling your kids, if they're, or your grandkids, whether they're going to go be a coder, go code for DOS, because a lot of government systems still use that, and there's very few people around that actually do it. Little side note. But the thing about DOS is it's actually simple and it works. It's very robust. It doesn't break down over time. It's a very simple system in it. So again, it's unique to California because it's expensive to do it. And this was done decades ago. But we're seeing the benefit of that today. Okay, moving on. Other California requirements we have, well, I actually can't even quite see all that. We do have, we don't have the gun show loophole or the private party transfer. We have the unsafe handgun list, which is, there's a list of firearms that are considered not unsafe. I guess we can't really say that a firearm is a safe firearm because it is designed to shoot and to kill. But these are firearms that have had some sort of testing. For instance, it's been fired at least 600 times. It's been dropped multiple times to make sure that there's no misfire. We're trying to get away from some of the Saturday night specials that we had like in the 80s and early 90s, making sure that the firearm is not going to expend a bullet unless you actually pull the trigger. It also has 3 features that needs to be on the firearms these days. It needs to have a magazine safety disconnect, which means that if the magazine is not in the firearm or not properly seated in the firearm, it won't fire. A lot of law enforcement firearms used to have that. Law enforcement officers usually remove that feature, but it is still a good feature when it comes to home safe storage. Number 2, a chamber load indicator. Chamber load indicators have been on firearms since, I think, 1936 to one extent or another. California just took it to the next step and made it very obvious that if there is a bullet or a cartridge in the chamber of the handgun, that it's clearly designated not only by color but by verbiage that the firearm is loaded. Even though you should always consider every firearm that you have as loaded, this one, it makes it very clear. Both of those were controversial to one extent or another. A few manufacturers finally broke away. They broke away to the extent that they just didn't do them for the handguns that were coming to California. They did them to all the firearms that they were producing, or at least the semi-automatic handguns. And they called it was for the concealed carry people around the nation. So again, California law can push things in a certain direction. Finally, microstamping, which I'm going to go over somewhat extensively. But microstamping is like a firearms DNA. What it does is on semi-automatic handguns, when a bullet is fired, the casing comes out, and the casing, according to the first legislation, was going to be marked in 2 places with some type of firearm identification code that just like a vehicle identification code would correspond to the make, model, and caliber of the firearm. Here in California, we can then identify who was the last person who legally possessed that firearm. A lot of lawsuits went over with that. The lawsuit was formally named Pena versus Lindley. They sued me over it. Not even the Attorney General, but they sued me personally over the implementation of that, saying that they can't do it. It's impossible. Well, this is the United States. I don't think really anything is impossible when it comes to the engineering, especially or something like that. And the industry finally said that yes, they can do one of the microstamps, but it's going to be difficult to do the 2. Went up all the way to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court decided not to hear it. So our California's Unsafe Handgun Act is in place, as is microstamping. But since it's been the law now, the law was passed in 2007. It wasn't implemented until 2013 because of legal challenges and patent infringements on the technology. But in May 2013, it became law. And the industry said they can do it between $3 to $10 per firearm, but they still haven't done it. So 3 years ago, Brady ran legislation in order to reduce the 2 microstamped points of the cartridge to 1, which is basically the firearm pin microstamp, to get the industry in order to implement that here in California. They still have not. 2 other states have implemented microstamping to one extent or another, New Jersey and New York. So we're trying to push the industry between some of the more democratic states into producing this technology and put it into their firearms. California is taking legislation this year that is basically going to say that all newly manufactured firearms in California are going to have microstamped. Whether they're currently grandfathered on the list or not, by a particular date, they need to be microstamped. And if the industry doesn't do it, California will do it for them at more cost than the $3 to $10 per firearm. So how I describe that to people is, and again, great group to talk about, I didn't know about DNA until the O.J. Simpson trial. I used to come home from graveyard, watch the court briefs before the court actually started, before I went to bed, and they started talking about this thing called dinucleosic something acid. Oh, okay, great, DNA. Now, if you ask most people and most law enforcement, they didn't know about DNA before the O.J. Simpson trial. Does everyone know about DNA now? I mean, you're not going to get a conviction, especially on a murder case, without DNA these days. It is just so synonymous with, hey, it's technology. So microstamping is a lot like that. It takes time for the DNA database to build up the number of people that are in that database. Same thing for microstamping. Is it going to be effective next year? Yeah, probably not that effective. Only maybe a couple cases. 25 years from now, when that database has, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of firearms in it, is it going to be more effective? Absolutely. It takes time for this stuff to work. If we had this working from 2007, we'd be seeing a lot more cases solved, especially in communities of color, which their homicide rates for the closures are in the 30 percentiles. Only 30% of cases are actually closed in a number of areas that are predominantly have people of color. Say places like Compton, Oakland, parts of LA. We can do better than that. And one of the things is microstamping. Does it make the gun safer? No. But it is the DNA of the firearm, and it will be revolutionary when we get the industry to do it, or California just says, we're going to do it ourselves. That's what makes California a little bit unique. Okay, different lawsuits. Our assault weapon lawsuits. Assault weapon registration, to one extent or another, has been around since 1989. We're on the 5th iteration of assault weapon registration, because every time California tries to get rid of these firearms, the industry finds some way, some loophole through the law. Now, as of right now, most of California's assault weapon bans have been upheld, and even in McDonald and the Heller cases, which Justice Scalia said he changed the meaning of the Second Amendment by where a comma was placed. Even he said in that opinion that you can't have any firearm that you want at any time. There is a limitation to the Second Amendment. Assault weapons is one of those limitations. So although a lot of other states don't have an assault weapons ban, our assault weapons ban here in California was upheld. High capacity magazines. Again, goes with our semi-automatic handguns and our assault weapons. And if you have a lower capacity magazine, you have less death. So if you want to compare that, you see the shooting that happened to Gabby Gifford in Arizona, where the suspect had a Glock pistol and a 30-round magazine. Even though there were people in the audience that had a firearm, nobody engaged with him until he decided to reload the firearm. Because it takes a lot for someone to charge someone with a firearm that's still shooting. They waited for him to reload, and they were able to disarm him. You look at an incident that happened at a synagogue in Poway, California, down in San Diego County. Somebody went in there with a assault weapon. It was actually a Smith & Wesson assault weapon, AR-15 style, but it only had 10-round magazines. He shot his 10 rounds, shot a number of people, killed one person there, but when he went to reload, again, people were able to engage with him. It will be very difficult for us to stop all mass shootings. We have too many firearms that are already out there, too many high-capacity magazines that are already out there. But we can reduce the victimology and the amount of people that are shot at some of these instances. High-capacity magazine bans work. If you look at what happened between 1994 and 2004, when we had a federal ban on them, we didn't have the mass shootings that we did right afterwards, and has been growing ever since. So, problem with our high-capacity magazine is it's kind of in flux right now. It went down to the federal court in San Diego. The judge down there made a weird decision, basically saying that was unconstitutional. And for a couple of days, that it was allowed to bring in high-capacity magazines. Millions of high-capacity magazines were brought into California and sold. So the 20 years before of what happened really kind of went out the door. Ninth Circuit put a stop to that, put an injunction saying that that's we're not going to go with that decision until we look at it as an entire court. But the damage is already done. Millions and millions of high-capacity magazines came into California during that time frame. So a lot of great work was undone overnight. Trying to see what the next one is.
Ghost guns.
Ghost guns. All right. Has everybody or anybody know what a ghost gun is? Talked about? Giant loophole. So under past federal guidelines, if a firearm was in 80% of its of a full configuration, it didn't need to be serialized. And if it doesn't need to be serialized, didn't have to have a background check. A couple of companies took that opportunity and they started building these buy, build, shoot kits. And the kits are easier to put together than Legos. It really is. I could put together most of my, okay, I'll say my daughter's Lego sets, but they're probably really mine. Sets easier than I can put together one of the ghost gun kits easier than I can put together the Lego sets. Then if you want to do a model car or model plane set, again, a ghost gun kit is just far easier. Problem with that is we don't know how many of them have been sold. We're speculating into the millions, but it completely goes around all of California's and all the federal government's background check processes because there is no background check. And what we've seen since 2016, where California could have put a stop to it, but a particular Democratic governor didn't see the public safety issue at the time, vetoed the legislation. And with that, year over year, California law enforcement, you're seeing 100, 200, 400, 1,000% increase of the confiscation of ghost guns year over year. It's only going to increase. Even though the ATF has done a lot to mitigate that issue, again, they're already out there. And it makes it very difficult for us to improve upon that. There's a lot of litigation against the companies that produce those. Most of those are by city governments because they've been used in a massive amount of shootings, specifically homicides, because they're tailor-made towards criminal activity. Okay, I'll cut that off. I could literally talk for days. This is what I do. I've lived this for a long time. But I want to give you the opportunity to ask questions that are more concerning to individuals and as a group here. So ask away, and I'll do my best to answer them.
Okay. How are the laws enforced? For example, selling a gun to someone without a license. How is that enforced?
So here in California, we also have a gun store enforcement program. We have regulators and special agents that go to the gun stores, and they basically do audits of their activity. The alcohol, tobacco, and firearms also does that, but here in California, we also have a state program. So we can identify what guns are coming in to a particular firearms dealer, how they are leaving, if they're being sold to another dealer or they're being sold to private individuals, and if those firearm dealers are actually following not only federal, but state law. There are a couple of cities, San Diego, Los Angeles, most notably, that also do their own inspections of these firearm dealers. So some firearm dealers, depending on where they're at, will be inspected, literally 3 times. Unfortunately, we can't get to every firearm dealer every year. California's looking about 3 to 5 years before a dealer is actually inspected. We're looking at ways to reduce that time frame. Under ATF regulations and how they look at things, they're being inspected every 5 to 7 years. A lot of damage can be done during that time frame. So we want to do a 1 to 3 year inspection program here in California.
But if I own a gun and I sell it to my neighbor, how do you know? And my neighbor doesn't have a license. How is that kind of, because a lot of guns are transferred to somebody else that way.
Can you repeat the question?
So the question is, if I wanted to sell a gun to my crazy neighbor, and I do, how does anybody know? And the first part of that is we probably wouldn't with a lot of things. However, if that gun is seized by law enforcement at some point, we can trace back the ownership of the firearm far more accurately in California, and then we can start looking at that saying, hey, this firearm was transferred between these 3 individuals outside of California law. Problem is, it's a misdemeanor, so statute of limitations of misdemeanors are normally 1 year. So even if it does occur, we have to identify that crime and prosecute it within 1 year of it being done. And that's one of the limitations with it. However, We do rely on most people to do the right thing and to follow the law, and you'd be surprised a lot of people actually do. If we're finding an individual has a lot of firearms and we find out that they're selling them, that's trafficking, which is a far different issue, and it is a felony. Depending on the type of felony and how that firearm was used, the statute of limitations can be between 3 and 7 years. So our laws aren't perfect, but we're trying.
Okay, next question. Is there a concern that increase in gun policy restrictions actually have the opposite effect by increasing sales? And the example is firearm applications rise under a Democratic president?
That's a very astute question, and unfortunately, when we have more firearm legislation, it's one of the best sellers of firearms. So here in California, before we had our last assault weapon registration period, we had unprecedented sales of assault weapons. President Obama was one of the best sellers of firearms, unfortunately, across our nation, because the NRA and the National Shooting Sports Foundation said that he's going to take all of your guns. Did he do that? No, he didn't. But they are able to peddle fear, and fear is what sells the firearms. Not just the person who's in office, but it's the fear of it. And they use that very, very astutely against firearm legislation. And we do see the numbers here in California with some legislation that went through right beforehand, unprecedented sales of assault weapons or certain types of handguns because of the legislation that was going to be pushed through and signed.
Okay, next question. What is your view of the meaning of the Second Amendment, and how does it differ from the NRA's view?
I'm going to take a big pass on that one, because it's being recorded, and my views of the Second Amendment probably don't coincide as much with the Brady campaign. But how should I say this politely? When I was at the National City Police Department, it had the third highest crime per capita in California. Only Oakland and Compton had more crime at the time. And I've seen far too many teenagers and young adults at homicide scenes, especially when I was in patrol, providing CPR for them, although they were going to die. And when you see somebody die right in front of you when they're 16 years old, it kind of changes your perspective about things. Because everything that they were going to be has been taken away from them. Because somebody with a firearm decided not to fight with them, but just to shoot them. So I think in a civilized society, it's not the same society that my dad grew up in Oklahoma, where they had the shotgun because he had to go help feed his siblings. It's different today, and I'm not opposed to firearms, but when we talk about military style firearms and high capacity magazines, do we really need that? Isn't that why we have the Marine Corps, the Army? I don't think the United States is ever going to be invaded. I'm not worried about Canada or Mexico trying to invade us as a country. So do we really need those weapons? I don't think not every law enforcement officer needs to have an assault weapon. So, but we're starting to see that more and more. And they're training that against who? Against us. I tell my students, the police department's power comes from the people.
Okay, what is one law that you would like to see implemented to reduce gun violence?
I think we need to move the conversation away from assault weapons to semi-automatic rifles, especially ones that have a capacity for more than 10 rounds. That wouldn't exclude most hunting rifles that can have a 10-round magazine. But when it comes to, it's hard to identify it's not hard to identify, but there's always going to be loopholes. If you just look at a maximum capacity of 10 rounds and an internal magazine of a semi-automatic firearm, That's going to do a lot in reducing victimology in shootings, whether they're mass shootings or day-to-day shootings.
Okay, is anyone checking the ammunition sales online and in gun shops or Walmart, for example?
So Walmart is the biggest seller of firearms in the United States, just because they're one of the biggest corporations. In California, they are the biggest ammunition sellers. However, they've been very forthcoming with the Department of Justice when we were implementing that law. They wanted to make sure they were doing things and doing things right, as is most of the big dealers. On top of the firearm dealer inspection program, we do have an ammunition vendor dealer inspection program. So is it perfect? No. Is it getting better? Yes. But we do look at what these ammunition vendors are doing when it comes to selling firearms. When I've gone to the gun shows here, my first thing I always look at is, are they actually selling it the way that they should be? Because gun shows are actually one of the biggest locations to purchase ammunition, and they are. So that is working, and the Department of Justice is identifying people who are prohibited that are trying to purchase ammunition. So the system is working.
Okay, what is happening at the federal level for gun control? What are the chances for change?
None. The effort is still going on. I mean, every Congress, and that legislation is pushed forward for eliminating the private party exemption, so that all firearm sales have a background check. Always looking at the high capacity magazine and assault weapon bans. However, unless you have a large majority in one house or the other, and you have a Democratic president, it makes it very difficult. Right now, with the House and Republican control, it's going to be very difficult. And after the Las Vegas shooting and after the shooting of some of these schools, if change didn't happen then, it makes it more difficult for states like California, because unless federal law is changed, it makes it difficult. Now, President Biden has done made a number of executive orders, especially for ATF, to look at ways that they can redo their regulations, but regulations can be changed with the next president. So it makes it difficult. And hopes and prayers don't really cut it anymore, because that's all that they say. Well, I hope and I pray that there's some change at the federal level, because if you look at the number of people that are dying here in the United States per year through the gun violence, and gun violence includes suicide by firearm, you're looking around 34,000 to 35,000 people a year are dying from that. It's the leading cause of death for young people. It bypassed automobiles, which over the years, I remember sitting in a car, the big giant station wagon with no safety belts on whatsoever. Safety belt laws work, airbags work, crumple zones work on automobiles. Why hasn't the firearm industry looked at different ways of making their firearms a little bit less and a little bit safer, especially when it comes to safe storage on a national level? That hasn't happened. They even have a pretty good deal where you can't sue firearm manufacturers. It makes it very difficult for you to sue them, even when what they did was wrong. So they have a lot of protections. Unfortunately, as all of you have seen, it takes a great deal to make change on a federal level. But we live here in California, and we're protecting the laws that we have here.
Okay, somebody wants to know who the manufacturers of the ghost gun kits are.
So there's a few different manufacturers, but the biggest one is out of Dayton, Nevada. It's called Polymer 80. They actually make the best quality one, which it's very difficult to, if you build that ghost gun up, it's hard to figure out which one was the ghost gun and which one was made by Glock. So Polymer 80 is probably the biggest and the best one out there. And they're currently under lawsuit from a number of different entities, including the city of Los Angeles.
Are those the ones that can't be detected on the
Can you repeat that?
And the question was, they can't be detected. No, they can't. They are metal. They're polymer and polymer 80 and metal. But you can get the 3D printed guns that you can make a single shot one that is very difficult to go through a metal detector. It may not be detected, but it will be detected on an X-ray machine. So it just kind of depends how you do it. But those are very simple, one shot and you're done. And I think they're probably more dangerous to the person who's shooting it. They're probably going to blow up in your hand more than anything else. But 3D printed guns are becoming more sophisticated. That is the next area, and we don't have a solution to that.
Okay, I think two more. Okay, second to the last question. Okay, so,
There is another one over there.
oh, okay. Okay, so are Laguna Woods residents allowed to have guns? And if so, how many people in Laguna Woods have them? Is this public information?
Yes, the Second Amendment does protect the ownership of firearms. Do I know how many people in Laguna Woods have them? No. And can you get that information? No. Actually, the Department of Justice protects that information because it is a protected right. They can give you numbers of how many people in a particular area have purchased a firearm, but they won't release information specifically about who purchased that firearm. That's the other issue with the armed prohibited person system, that it's not public knowledge. You can't check like you can with the sex offender registration. You can't check the armed prohibited persons system to find out who might be prohibited in your neighborhood.
Can a person over 90 get a gun?
Yes, as long as they can, pass the background check, pass the firearm safety certificate program, show safe demonstration. There's no age limit. Only age limit that we have is, it used to be 18 for long rifles and 21 for handguns. That's been changed right now to 21 for the most part, unless you have a hunting license, but that is under legal challenge right now. And I don't know what that's kind of a, toss a coin to see how that's gonna come out.
Someone 95 years old can get a gun.
Yep. As long as you pass everything.
Okay, the last question. Is substance abuse treatment a reason to become to be put on the prohibited, firearms prohibited list?
Treatment of substance abuse, no. But one of the questions that it does ask if you're a habitual narcotic offender. And if you mark yes to that, then you won't be sold a firearm. Or if identified that you have a number of arrests for possession or use of controlled substances, that could be a prohibiting factor. But if you're seeking treatment, a lot of states, including California, that's kind of how we want things to happen. We want people to go and get treatment for the issues that they have.
So, all right.
Got it?
Yeah, I got it. Yeah, so the last question is, can you contrast our California laws with Texas laws, and what is the impact of Texas laws or other states' laws on what happens in California?
So if you compare Texas and California, it's kind of comparing night to day. There really isn't any Texas firearm laws outside the federal government's laws. If you look at historically, you have to kind of look at each state independently, because you have to look at where they started from. California in the 80s and 90s had far more crime, especially violent crime with the use of firearms, than Texas did during that same time frame. So if you see how California has dropped from, we were like maybe in the top 10, now we're in the bottom 5 when it comes to use of firearms. Texas is still a pretty high area when it comes to the use of firearms in crimes, higher than California. There's some differences in how they look at what is considered a mass shooting based on a historical definition compared to a new definition. I know there was an article I think came out last week comparing that we still have more mass shootings here in California than Texas does, and Texas really doesn't have any laws. That was using the historical definition of a mass shooting. If you look at the new definition, we do have a few percentage points lower when it comes to mass shootings. But mass shootings are something that's very difficult to stop. We have to look at what is the day-to-day use of firearms in crime. And if you look at that, California has far less than Texas does. And if you compare that to what we had 30 years ago, it is far less. It's been a dramatic decrease. If you look at the use of firearms in suicide, it is absolutely dramatic, the decrease that we've had here in California. Because we do have treatment programs, we have different issues to look at, but we're not giving firearms to people who have a mental health issue, whether that's temporary or long-term. If it's long-term, they're probably never gonna have a firearm. But if it's short-term, solve your problems, then go purchase a firearm. So if that's what you choose to do. Again, those rates have dropped dramatically in California. Not just because of mental health treatment, but I really do believe with our firearm laws that we have here in California, that has been a dramatic decrease over the last 30 years.
Thank you so much.
I just want to say thank you for tonight. Those were some excellent questions. I know we just kind of scratched the surface of everything that's going on, but I want to thank you for the time tonight. Thank you for an invitation, and I wish you all well. Take care.
How about if we ask Steve to come back, please? The club donated $200 to the Brady United organization, and Sarah has the table there. She brought information about Steve's organization, Brady United. If you want to give a donation directly to the organization, you can go to the table there. You can pick up materials over there, and you are fantastic, Steve. Thank you so much for being here.